Please subscribe. It helps a lot.
In the summer of 2005, everyone in Fisherville, Kentucky knew the Pope Lick Trestle could kill you. What they didn't agree on was whether it ever called your name first. Caleb Turner had grown up within earshot of train horns, their low wails threading through humid nights and settling into his bones like a second pulse. The sound never bothered him as a child. It meant distance, movement. The idea that somewhere beyond the trees and tobacco fields there were places a person could go without anyone knowing their last name or their father's reputation. But by 20, the horns felt different. They sounded less like escape and more like a reminder that he had never left. He stood at the edge of the gravel access road, hands shoved into the pockets of his worn jeans, watching Luke Harper kick at a loose stone and send it skittering toward the trees. The air clung to them, thick with late summer humidity and the sweet rot of leaves along Pope Lick Creek below. Fireflies drifted in the underbrush, their soft pulses echoing the distant signal lights along the track. "You coming or not?" Luke asked without turning around. Caleb swallowed. "I'm coming." Luke grinned then, glancing back over his shoulder, and that grin did something inside Caleb's chest that he had never managed to name. It wasn't new. It had lived there for months, maybe years. A tight, bright ache that sharpened whenever Luke stood too close or laughed too easily, or said Caleb's name like it mattered. Caleb had learned to carry it the way he carried everything else. Quietly, carefully, without letting it show. They stepped onto the narrow path that led toward the trestle. The woods closed around them almost immediately, swallowing the road and the last traces of town. Here, the world narrowed to the crunch of gravel under their shoes, the hum of insects, and the faint metallic tang that always lingered near the tracks. Luke walked a half step ahead, brushing aside low branches, never looking back to see if Caleb followed. He never had to. The trestle revealed itself slowly, rising from the trees like a ribcage, dark wooden beams stretching over the ravine, the rails gleaming faintly in the fading light. Caleb had seen it countless times, but it always made him pause. There was something about the height, the way the bridge seemed to hover over the creek and the limestone outcroppings below, that made his stomach tighten. No place to stand if a train came. No railing high enough to trust. Just wood, iron, and the long drop into shadow. Luke stepped onto the planks without hesitation. The structure creaked softly under his weight. "Still standing," he said. "See? Nothing to be scared of." Caleb followed, forcing his feet to move. The boards felt warm through the thin soles of his shoes. He kept his eyes forward, on Luke's shoulders, on the familiar slope of his neck, on anything that wasn't the dark gap between the ties beneath them. The air out here felt different, quieter, as if the woods held their breath when someone crossed. They reached their usual spot near the middle, where the creek curved below and the trees opened just enough to reveal a strip of sky streaked pink and gold. Luke sat, legs dangling over the edge, and leaned back on his hands. Caleb lowered himself beside him, careful not to look down. He focused instead on the warmth radiating from Luke's shoulder, close enough that their shirts brushed when either of them shifted. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty. It felt full, like a held note waiting to resolve. Caleb listened to Luke's breathing, steady and unhurried, and wondered if he could memorize it. If there would ever come a time when he needed to. Luke broke the quiet first. "I leave next week," he said. Caleb had known it was coming. Luke had mentioned Louisville, mentioned an uncle with construction work, mentioned the possibility of somewhere new. But hearing it said out loud, "here," made it real in a way Caleb hadn't prepared for. The words seemed to settle into the wood beneath them. "Yeah," Caleb said. His voice sounded smaller than he meant it to. Luke nudged his knee lightly. "You could come with me." Caleb stared down the tracks where they disappeared into the trees. The idea flared bright and terrifying. Leaving, being seen, stepping into a life where he might have to name what he felt instead of hiding it behind long silences and almost touches. He imagined the town's eyes, his father's disapproval, the weight of everything he had never said pressing down. "I can't," he said. Luke didn't argue. He never pushed. That was part of what made it so hard, the way he offered possibility without demand. The way he seemed to believe Caleb would choose himself someday. Their hands rested between them on the plank. Caleb felt Luke's fingers brush his, just barely. A touch so light it could have been accidental. He didn't move away. He couldn't. The contact sent a quiet electricity up his arm, settling somewhere behind his ribs, a warmth edged with fear. "You ever notice?" Luke said softly. "We only tell the truth out here?" Caleb's throat tightened. He wanted to answer. He wanted to say everything he had swallowed for months, that Luke was the only place he felt steady, that the thought of him leaving felt like a door closing on air he didn't know he needed to breathe. But the words stayed lodged behind his teeth, heavy and impossible. The woods around them seemed to still. The constant drone of cicadas faltered, then stopped entirely, as if someone had cut a wire. Caleb frowned, lifting his head. The sudden silence pressed in on his ears. "You hear that?" Luke asked. Before Caleb could answer, a faint vibration hummed through the rails beneath them. Not the thunder of an approaching train, but something softer, almost like a pulse. Caleb's skin prickled. He glanced down the length of the trestle, toward the dark line where the bridge vanished into trees. Somewhere in the distance, something struck wood with a slow, deliberate weight. A single sound. Not the creak of the bridge, not the scuttle of an animal. A hoofstep. Caleb's fingers tightened involuntarily against Luke's. He opened his mouth to speak, to suggest they leave, to break whatever fragile tension had settled over the trestle. But the words tangled in his throat. Luke was already looking down the tracks, his expression shifting from curiosity to something harder to name. The air held its breath. And Caleb, sitting beside the only person who had ever made him feel seen, realized with a cold, creeping certainty that the place they had claimed as their own was listening. The silence did not break all at once. It thinned, stretched, and settled over the trestle like a held breath no one dared release. Caleb kept his hand where it was, his fingers pressed against Luke's knuckles, as if that small contact could anchor them both to the wood beneath their feet and the world they understood. The faint vibration in the rails pulsed again, softer this time, not the thunder of steel wheels, but something slower, almost deliberate. Luke tilted his head, listening. "Probably nothing," he said, though his voice had lost its easy certainty. Caleb wanted to agree. He wanted to laugh and say it was the bridge settling, or a deer moving through the ravine below, or anything that belonged to the ordinary world. But the woods remained unnaturally still. No insects, no rustle of leaves. Even the creek below seemed to hush itself, as though the dark water had chosen not to speak. The sound came again. A single heavy step on wood. Not near them. Farther down the trestle, where the beams narrowed into shadow and the trees swallowed the last of the evening light. Caleb's chest tightened. The shape of the bridge funneled every sound forward and back, turning distance into an illusion. It could have been 50 yards away. It could have been 10. Luke shifted, pulling his hand away so he could brace himself against the plank. The absence of that touch left Caleb's skin cold. "You think someone's out there?" Luke asked. The question carried more hope than fear. Caleb heard it. The possibility that it was just another person, another teenager testing the legend, someone they could laugh about later. Someone real. "I don't know," Caleb said. The truth tasted like metal. Luke pushed himself to his feet in one fluid motion, balancing easily despite the narrow ties beneath his boots. He had always moved like he trusted the ground to hold him. Caleb rose more slowly, every muscle tight, his gaze fixed down the tracks. The trestle stretched ahead in a straight, uncompromising line, the rails reflecting the last smear of pink sky. "Hey," Luke called, his voice carrying into the dimness. "Anyone out there?" The words seemed to vanish before they reached the trees. Caleb stepped closer, his shoulder nearly brushing Luke's back. The warmth radiating from him felt fragile now, something that could be taken away by the wrong movement, the wrong word. He wanted to tell Luke to sit back down, to leave, to let the silence close over whatever waited at the far end of the bridge. But Luke stood there stubborn and open as if the world had never given him reason to expect anything but honesty. Another vibration traveled through the rails, a low hum that settled into Caleb's bones. He knew the rhythm of trains. This was not that. This was slower, spaced like breath. Step. The sound echoed along the planks, each reverberation folding into the next. Caleb's stomach dropped. He imagined the weight behind it, the shape of something that did not belong on 2 legs or 4, something that moved with intention rather than instinct. Luke took a tentative step forward. Caleb's hand shot out, fingers closing around Luke's wrist. Wait. Luke glanced back, surprise flickering across his face. For a moment their eyes locked, and Caleb felt the familiar pull, the urge to say everything he had never said, to confess the truth Luke had always treated as inevitable. But the words stalled in the face of the quiet pressing in around them. It's probably just some guy, Luke said gently. We can't just stand here all night. Caleb's grip tightened. We can leave. The suggestion hung between them, fragile as glass. Leave. Abandon the place that had held their almost truths, their shared silences, their unspoken promises. Leave before whatever waited in the dark could claim it. Luke studied him, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. Then he smiled. Not the broad, teasing grin Caleb knew, but a smaller, softer curve that felt like understanding. We always leave, Luke said. That's kind of the problem, isn't it? The words landed harder than Caleb expected. He opened his mouth, but the trestle creaked beneath them, a low groan that cut through his thoughts. The air seemed to thicken, heavy and warm, pressing against his lungs. From the far end of the bridge, a shape shifted, not a clear form, just a deeper darkness against the trees, a suggestion of height where there should have been none. Caleb squinted, trying to force the world into something recognizable. His eyes watered with the effort. Another step, closer. The sound carried a weight that did not match any animal he knew. Too deliberate, too measured. The wood beneath their feet vibrated faintly in response, the tremor traveling up through Caleb's legs and into his chest where it settled beside his heartbeat. Luke turned back toward the darkness, his posture straightening. Hello? He called again, louder this time. You're gonna get yourself killed out here. His voice echoed down the length of the trestle, bouncing off beams and rails, returning thinner and distorted. Caleb flinched at the sound of it, at the way the bridge seemed to swallow and reshape human voices. The woods did not answer. Instead, the silence deepened, thick and waiting. Caleb became aware of his own breathing, shallow and uneven. He forced himself to inhale slowly, the humid air sticking to the back of his throat. He could smell creosote and rust, the faint sweetness of decaying leaves, and beneath it all, something else. A hot animal scent that did not belong to deer or raccoon or any creature he had ever known. Luke, he said quietly. Please. Luke didn't move. The darkness at the far end of the trestle shifted again, resolving for a fraction of a second into the outline of something tall and wrong, its silhouette jagged where the trees should have framed it. Caleb's breath hitched. He blinked and the shape seemed to fold back into shadow as if it had never been there at all. Another step sounded on the wood. Closer now. The bridge, their bridge, no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like a corridor. Narrow, unavoidable, leading them toward something that had been waiting longer than either of them had been alive. Caleb's fingers curled into his palms, nails biting into skin. He wanted to run. He wanted to drag Luke with him to leave the trestle empty and silent behind them. But Luke stood at the edge of the unknown, shoulders squared, as if he believed that whatever approached could be reasoned with, spoken to, understood. The rails hummed once more beneath their feet, and from somewhere ahead, just beyond the reach of the fading light, the sound of a hoof striking wood echoed toward them, steady and unhurried, as if it had all the time in the world. The hoofstep echoed again, closer now. A slow and deliberate strike that carried through the wooden beams and up into Caleb's bones. He could feel it in the arches of his feet, in the hollow of his throat, in the space behind his eyes where fear gathered and refused to take shape. The trestle, once their refuge, had narrowed into a single, unavoidable path. Forward meant the sound. Back meant abandoning Luke. Luke did not move. Caleb's gaze fixed on the back of Luke's neck, on the fine line of sweat glistening at his hairline, on the way his shoulders rose and fell with each steady breath. He had always admired that steadiness, the way Luke met the world head-on, as if honesty alone could make it safe. Caleb had built his own life around avoidance, soft answers, and careful silence. Standing there now, he felt the distance between those approaches like a physical space he could not cross. Another vibration trembled through the rails. Not the rolling thunder of a train, not yet, but a low, living hum that seemed to pulse in time with the approaching steps. Caleb swallowed, his mouth dry. He forced his voice past the tightness in his chest. "Luke," he whispered. "Let's go." Luke's head tilted slightly, as if listening to something Caleb could not hear. "You hear that?" he murmured. Caleb did hear something, but it was not the hoofsteps. It was the faintest thread of sound woven through the silence, and a voice so soft it might have been the wind moving through the beams. "Don't go." The words brushed against Caleb's ear, intimate and unmistakable. He froze. The voice sounded like his own, but clearer, braver, stripped of hesitation. It was the voice he imagined Luke heard when Caleb spoke, the version of himself he had never managed to become. Luke's breath caught. "Cal." Caleb's heart slammed against his ribs. "I didn't—" His throat closed around the rest of the sentence. The voice came again from the far end of the trestle, carried on the still air. "Don't go." Luke took a step forward. Caleb's hand shot out, fingers closing around Luke's sleeve. "I didn't say that," he said, his voice breaking. "Luke, it's not me." Luke turned, confusion flickering across his face, but beneath it, something else. Hope. A fragile, dangerous hope that made Caleb's chest ache. "It sounded like you," Luke said. Another step sounded ahead, heavier now, the wood answering with a low groan. Caleb's grip tightened. "Please," he whispered. "Please don't." Luke looked back toward the darkness. The fading light caught the curve of his cheek, the line of his mouth, the expression Caleb had memorized in 100 small moments. The look Luke wore when he believed something good was within reach. Caleb had never been able to give him that good thing. Not fully. Not with words. The voice drifted down the trestle once more. "You came back." This time, it sounded like Luke. The effect was immediate and devastating. Caleb watched the realization bloom across Luke's face. The recognition, the wonder, the fear. It was as if the trestle itself had learned the shape of Luke's longing and given it back to him. "Caleb," Luke breathed. "Did you hear that?" Caleb shook his head, though he had heard it clearly. The sound of Luke's own voice echoed back from the darkness, had cut deeper than the imitation of his own. It was wrong in a way he could not explain. Not distorted, not monstrous, just empty of the warmth that made Luke who he was. Another hoofstep. Closer. The shape at the far end of the trestle shifted again, resolving for a heartbeat into something too tall, too angular, its outline broken by the suggestion of horns that curved backward like hooked branches. Caleb blinked, and the image dissolved into shadow, leaving only the memory of wrongness behind. "Luke," he said, his voice raw. "It's not real, it's not—" "Then what is it?" Luke asked softly. Caleb had no answer. The rational explanations he had clung to, trespassers, animals, echoes, fell away in the face of the voice that knew their names, their tones, the fragile places they hid from the world. Whatever stood at the far end of the trestle did not need to chase them. It only needed to speak. The rails hummed again, louder this time, a warning threaded through the wood. Caleb felt the vibration surge upward, a tremor that set his teeth on edge. He knew that sound. A train, somewhere beyond the trees, rounding the long curve toward the bridge. Still distant, but coming. "Luke, we have to go," he said, pulling harder. "Now." Luke hesitated. The conflict played across his face. Fear battling hope, reason tangling with the possibility that the voice meant something more than danger. Caleb saw the moment Luke wavered, the instant when belief became a choice. From the darkness, the voice came one last time. "Don't go." It sounded like Caleb, like Luke, like every unspoken promise they had ever shared, given shape and sound. Luke's fingers slipped from Caleb's grasp. He stepped forward onto the trestle toward the waiting dark. Caleb lunged after him, panic breaking through the paralysis that had held him still. "Luke, stop!" The rails screamed beneath them, the distant thunder of the train swelling into a roar. Wind rushed through the ravine, hot and sudden, carrying the smell of metal and oil. The bridge shuddered under the gathering force. Luke turned, confusion flashing across his face as the reality of the oncoming train crashed through whatever illusion had held him. For a single, suspended moment, their eyes met, Luke's wide with shock, Caleb's with a terror so complete it felt like it might split him open. Behind Luke, the shape in the darkness stood motionless, its outline sharp against the dim glow of the sky, its presence as solid and patient as the bridge itself. The train's horn blared, deafening. Caleb ran. The trestle shook beneath his feet, the world collapsing into noise and light in the impossible distance between where he stood and where Luke was, reaching back toward him with a hand Caleb could not quite grasp. Then the train was upon them, a wall of steel and wind and screaming rails that swallowed everything in its path. When it passed, the bridge fell silent. Luke was gone. Silence returned too quickly. The roar of the train receded into the distance, its thunder fading along the tracks until it became just another sound swallowed by the Kentucky hills. The trestle shuddered once more, a lingering tremor running through the wood as if the bridge itself were trying to remember what had just passed over it. Then there was nothing. No horn, no wind, no echo of steel wheels. Only the faint creak of beams settling back into place. Caleb stood frozen in the middle of the tracks, his chest heaving, his hands still outstretched toward empty air. "Luke?" The name tore from him, raw and disbelieving. No answer. He stumbled forward, his boots slipping on the worn planks, his eyes searching for any sign. A shadow, a movement, the shape of a body clinging to the side of the bridge. The ravine below lay in darkness, the creek a thin ribbon of dull reflection between limestone outcroppings. The trees stood motionless, their leaves heavy and still as if they had witnessed too many nights like this and refused to stir. "Luke." Caleb's voice broke on the second syllable. The sound fell flat against the wood and iron, swallowed before it could travel. He dropped to his knees near the place where Luke had stood, palms slamming against the planks. The warmth of the board seeped into his skin, mingling with the sharp tang of creosote. For a wild moment, he pressed his ear to the wood as if the bridge might hold an echo of Luke's heartbeat, some trace of the life that had been there seconds before. Nothing. His breath came in ragged pulls. The world tilted, narrowed, and then expanded all at once, leaving him dizzy with the enormity of what had just happened. Luke had been there. Luke had turned toward him. Luke had reached. Caleb squeezed his eyes shut, the memory fragmenting before it could settle into something he could survive. A faint sound behind him made him flinch. He turned, heart lurching, expecting, hoping, to see Luke climbing back onto the planks, bruised and shaken but alive. Instead, the trestle stretched empty in both directions, the rails gleaming faintly in the returning night. The woods remained silent, their earlier hush deepening into something heavier, more deliberate. Then he saw it. A single impression in the dust near the ties, deeper than a footprint, the edges sharp where the wood grain had held the shape. The outline was unmistakable, a split hoof, pressed into the creosote-streaked surface with enough force to mark it. Caleb's stomach twisted. He stared at the print, his mind refusing to reconcile what his eyes insisted was real. No animal could have stood here, on these narrow planks, at this height. No animal could have moved with that measured weight, that terrible patience. He lifted his gaze slowly toward the far end of the trestle. Nothing. No silhouette. No horns. No movement. But the absence itself felt intentional, as if whatever had stood there had chosen to leave now that its work was done. A sob forced its way up Caleb's throat. He pressed his fist against his mouth, trying to contain the sound, But the grief came anyway, a raw, broken noise that tore through the stillness and left him shaking. He folded forward, forehead resting against the wood, his body curling around the space Luke had occupied minutes before. He had let go. The thought struck with brutal clarity. Luke had slipped from his grasp, and Caleb had not held on tightly enough. He had hesitated. He had doubted his own voice, his own fear, and in that hesitation, Luke had stepped forward, believing the lie the darkness had offered him. He had died thinking Caleb called him. The realization hollowed him out. Caleb's chest constricted, the air refusing to fill his lungs. He clawed at the planks beneath him, splinters biting into his skin, as if pain could anchor him to something solid. The trestle had been their place. The one stretch of the world where Caleb had allowed himself to exist without shrinking. Now it felt like a mouth that had closed around Luke and swallowed him whole. "Come back," he whispered, the words dissolving into the wood. "Please. I never—" The wind stirred faintly through the ravine, carrying the scent of damp earth and metal. It moved past him without answering. Minutes passed, or hours. Caleb could not tell. Time fractured into jagged pieces, each second stretched thin by the weight of what was no longer there. Eventually, the distant hum of insects returned, tentative at first, then swelling into the familiar chorus of summer. The world resumed its rhythm as if nothing had been taken from it. Caleb pushed himself upright, his movements slow and unsteady. His knees protested, his palms stung, and his throat burned with unshed words. He looked once more down the length of the trestle, half expecting to see Luke's silhouette reappear, to hear his easy laugh, to feel his shoulder brush against his own. The bridge remained empty. He forced himself to stand, gripping the rail for balance. The metal felt cold against his skin. Each step he took toward the far end felt wrong, like a betrayal, leaving Luke behind, abandoning the place where his last breath had been stolen. But he could not stay. The trestle no longer belonged to them. It belonged to the silence that had answered Luke's name. Halfway across, Caleb paused and turned back. The moon had risen higher, washing the bridge in pale light. From this distance, the spot where Luke had stood was indistinguishable from any other plank, any other stretch of wood. The sameness struck Caleb harder than the loss itself. The world had already begun to erase the shape Luke had made in it. His gaze dropped once more to the faint hoofprint near the ties. The mark seemed darker now, as if the wood had absorbed something it could not release. Caleb swallowed, his mouth dry. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this was not an accident the town could explain away with warnings about trespassing in trains. Something had called Luke. Something had worn Caleb's voice like a mask and led him forward with the promise of a truth he had never dared to speak. And Caleb had been too late. He turned and continued toward the end of the trestle, each step heavier than the last. Behind him the bridge creaked softly, the sound carrying across the ravine like a memory that refused to fade. By the time he reached the trees, the insects had fully reclaimed the night, their chorus loud enough to drown out the echo of the train. The world looked unchanged. The same gravel road, the same dark line of forest, the same sky stretching overhead. Only Caleb had changed. He paused at the edge of the woods, his hand resting against the rough bark of a tree. The urge to look back clawed at him, but he forced his gaze forward. If he looked again, he feared he might see Luke standing there, waiting, asking why Caleb had not followed. The thought was unbearable. He stepped onto the path and began the walk back toward town, the gravel crunching under his boots, each sound too loud in the fragile quiet. Behind him, the trestle settled into the darkness, its beams and rails holding their silence. And somewhere beyond the trees, too far to see and too close to ignore, something waited with the patience of wood and iron, listening for the sound of a name spoken in the dark. The town called it an accident. They said the word with the weary certainty of people who had learned to survive by explaining away the things that frightened them. Trespassing, bad judgment, a train you couldn't outrun. The phrases passed from mouth to mouth like weather reports, practical and impersonal. By the end of the week, Luke Harper's name had become something softer in their voices, a cautionary tale folded into warnings about the trestle and the dangers of night. Caleb listened without correcting them. He sat through the murmured condolences, the firm handshakes, the quiet assurances that Luke hadn't suffered. He nodded when they spoke, because it was easier than trying to describe the sound of a voice that wasn't a voice, the shape of something that had waited in the dark and worn his name like a key. The truth had no place in the language of casseroles and sympathy cards. At night, he did not sleep. He lay on his back in the narrow bed he had slept in since childhood, staring at the ceiling while the house settled around him. The train horns sounded in the distance, their low calls threading through the dark, and each one tightened his chest until he had to sit up, breath coming shallow and fast. He replayed the moment on the trestle again and again, Luke turning, Luke reaching, Luke stepping forward, searching for the instant he could have changed, the word he could have spoken, the grip he could have tightened. He always arrived too late. On the third night, he heard the hoofsteps. They were faint at first, a dull thud against packed earth somewhere beyond his bedroom window. Caleb froze, the sheet clenched in his fist. He held his breath, counting the seconds, willing the sound to resolve into something ordinary, a deer in the yard, a neighbor's dog, the creak of branches in the wind. Another step, slow, measured, deliberate. He sat up, the mattress springs groaning beneath his weight. The sound stopped immediately, as if whatever had been there had been listening for his movement. The silence that followed was heavier than before, thick with the sense of being watched. Caleb stared at the dark rectangle of the window, half expecting to see a shape resolve against the glass, horns cutting into the faint glow of the yard light. Nothing appeared. He did not sleep for the rest of the night. Days blurred together. The town returned to its routines, the rhythm of work and weather smoothing over the raw edges of loss. Caleb moved through it all like a ghost, his answers automatic, his smiles hollow. The trestle sat at the edge of every thought, a dark line he could not cross and could not leave behind. A week after Luke's funeral, Caleb found himself driving toward it. He did not remember deciding to go. One moment he was turning onto the county road. The next he was pulling onto the gravel shoulder near the path they had walked 100 times. The trees stood silent in the late afternoon heat, their shadows long and cool across the ground. For a long moment he sat in the truck with the engine running, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles blanched. He told himself he would not go onto the trestle. He told himself he only needed to see it from a distance to prove that it was just wood and iron, that the world had not split open in the place where Luke had died. He cut the engine. The sudden quiet pressed against his ears. The path into the woods felt narrower than he remembered. Branches brushed his shoulders, leaves whispering against his skin. The air smelled of damp earth and sun-warmed bark. Every step carried the weight of memory. Luke walking ahead, Luke laughing, Luke glancing back with that easy smile that had once made the world feel wide and possible. The trestle emerged from the trees, unchanged. Caleb stopped at the edge of the gravel, his breath catching. The wooden beams rose over the ravine, the rails gleaming faintly in the afternoon light. From this distance it looked ordinary, a structure built for a purpose, nothing more. There was no sign of what had happened, no mark where Luke had stood, no trace of the hoofprint that had burned itself into Caleb's mind. He took one step forward. The insects fell silent. Caleb's heart lurched. He froze, the hairs on his arms lifting. The quiet spread outward, swallowing the buzz of summer, leaving the woods suspended in a waiting hush. He stared at the bridge, his vision tunneling, the edges of the world blurring. A figure moved at the far end of the trestle. Small, human, alone. Caleb's stomach dropped. A teenage boy, no more than 16, stood near the shadowed end, his posture slack, his head tilted as if listening. There was no car on the road, no bike leaning against the trees. He had walked here. Caleb knew the look on his face, the distant calm, the fragile hope. "Hey!" Caleb shouted, his voice cracking the silence. The boy did not turn. Caleb broke into a run, gravel scattering under his boots. "Hey! Get off there!" The rails hummed faintly beneath the structure, a low vibration that crawled up Caleb's spine. The boy took a slow step forward onto the planks, his movements deliberate, unhurried. "My friend's out there," the boy said, his voice soft, carrying across the distance. "He said he needed me." The words hit Caleb like a blow. He reached the base of the trestle, breath tearing in his lungs. "There's no one out there," he shouted. "You need to come back. Now." The boy hesitated, confusion flickering across his face. Behind him, the darkness at the far end of the bridge seemed to thicken, gathering into a shape Caleb refused to fully see. The rails vibrated again, louder this time, the distant promise of a train. Caleb stepped onto the first plank, his legs trembling. "Listen to me," he said, forcing his voice steady. "It's lying to you." The boy turned slowly, his expression blank. "He sounded just like him," he whispered. Caleb felt the truth of that settle into his bones. The thing in the dark did not need force. It needed longing, it needed trust. It needed the fragile, impossible hope that someone would finally say the words you had waited your whole life to hear. He reached the boy and grabbed his arm, pulling him back toward the gravel. The contact broke whatever trance had held him. The boy gasped, stumbling, his eyes widening as if waking from a dream. Behind them, the silence shattered. A single hoofstep struck the wood. Caleb did not look back. He dragged the boy off the trestle and onto the path, his heart hammering, his lungs burning. The insects resumed their chorus all at once, the sound almost deafening after the hush. The rails fell still beneath the bridge, the hum fading into nothing. The boy sagged against him, shaking. "I thought he needed me," he said, his voice small and broken. Caleb tightened his grip, his gaze fixed on the trees ahead. "I know," he said. He did not release the boy until they reached the road. Only then did he allow himself to turn and look back. The trestle stood empty against the fading light, its beams dark and silent. No shape lingered at the far end. No hoofprints marked the planks. But Caleb knew, with a certainty that settled into the marrow of his bones, that the thing that had taken Luke was still there, waiting, listening, learning the shape of new voices to wear. And this time, he had not been too late. The night Caleb returned to the trestle, he did not park on the gravel shoulder. He left his truck farther down the county road, out of sight of the path, and walked the rest of the way beneath a sky heavy with late summer heat. The air clung to his skin, thick and unmoving, the kind of night when sound carried too far and the woods seemed to listen. He moved carefully, each step deliberate, as if the ground itself might betray him if he rushed. He had come alone. The path felt narrower than ever, the branches brushing his shoulders like cautious hands. The insects droned in the undergrowth, a constant living chorus that reassured him with its ordinariness. He focused on that sound as he walked, the buzz, the chirr, the fragile insistence of life continuing. It was a rhythm the trestle had broken before. He would not let it break again. The bridge rose ahead through the trees, its dark beams etched against the dim glow of the sky. Caleb stopped at the edge of the gravel, his breath steady, his hands empty except for the weight of the iron spike he had taken from a rusted tie near the tracks weeks before. He had carried it since the day he pulled the boy from the trestle, its cold weight a promise in his palm. He stepped onto the first plank. The wood creaked softly beneath his boots. The insects continued their chorus. The rails lay still, reflecting the faint light in thin silver lines that stretched into darkness. He walked to the middle of the bridge and stopped where Luke had stood, where his life had ended in a roar of steel and wind. "I'm here," Caleb said. His voice did not echo. It settled into the wood and iron, absorbed without answer. For a long moment, nothing happened. The night held its breath. The insects sang. The creek whispered below. Caleb's heart beat steady in his chest, not the frantic hammer of fear, but a measured rhythm he had learned to trust. He stood with his shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on the far end of the trestle where shadow pooled between the beams. He did not have to wait long. The insects fell silent all at once, their chorus severed mid-note. The quiet that followed pressed in on his ears, thick and deliberate. Caleb's fingers tightened around the iron spike, the cool metal grounding him. A vibration stirred in the rails. Not the distant thunder of a train, not yet, but a low hum that pulsed beneath his feet like a second heartbeat. Caleb swallowed and held his ground. A hoofstep sounded in the darkness. Slow, measured, certain. The sound traveled along the planks, each strike reverberating through the beams. Caleb felt it in his bones, the same deliberate weight that had echoed the night Luke died. The shape at the far end of the trestle shifted, resolving gradually into something too tall, its outline broken by the suggestion of horns curving back like splintered branches. The voice came next. "Caleb." It was Luke's voice. The sound struck him with a force that stole his breath. For a heartbeat, the world tilted, the trestle dissolving into memory, Luke's laugh echoing in the warm dusk, the brush of his fingers against Caleb's hand. The longing he had buried surged upward, sharp and blinding. "You came back," the voice said. Luke's shape stepped into the faint light, whole and unbroken, his expression soft with the same fragile hope Caleb had seen the night he died. His eyes held that familiar warmth, the quiet certainty that had once made Caleb believe he might deserve more than silence. Caleb's throat tightened. Every instinct urged him forward, to close the distance, to reach for the life that had been stolen from them both. He did not move. "You're not him," he said, his voice rough but steady. "He never would have asked me to follow." The illusion flickered. Luke's face wavered, the warmth draining from it like color from a photograph left in the sun. The shape beneath the borrowed features twisted, lengthening, the outline of horns sharpening against the sky. The eyes that met Caleb's were no longer human. They reflected the faint light of the rails like twin signals, cold and unreadable. The creature took another step forward. The wood groaned beneath its weight. Caleb lifted the iron spike, his grip tightening until his knuckles ached. The hum in the rails deepened, the distant promise of a train threading through the structure. He could feel the vibration building, a gathering force he had studied, waited for, counted on. The Goat Man, because that was what it was, what the town's whispers had named it, did not rush him. It moved with the same patient certainty it had shown the night it took Luke, closing the distance one measured step at a time. Another hoof step. Closer. The hum became a tremor, the rails beginning to sing beneath the gathering weight of steel wheels somewhere beyond the curve. Caleb's heart matched the rhythm, steady and relentless. "Come," the creature said, its voice shifting, sliding between Luke's tone and Caleb's own, a chorus of longing and recognition. "You know why you're here." "I do," Caleb said. When the creature stepped within reach, he moved. He drove the iron spike downward with all the strength he had, the metal biting through hide and wood in a single brutal motion. The creature's hoof pinned to the plank, the impact reverberating through the trestle. A sound tore from it, not a scream, not a human cry, but a grinding, splintering noise that set Caleb's teeth on edge. The rails roared. The train burst from the darkness, a wall of steel and wind and thunder. The force of it slammed into Caleb, throwing him backward against the beams. Pain exploded along his ribs, his shoulder tearing as he struck the wood. He tasted blood, the world fracturing into light and noise and the shuddering fury of the passing cars. The creature could not move. Pinned to the trestle, bound to the tracks it had used to kill, it twisted beneath the onslaught, its form collapsing into something broken and wrong. The train thundered over it, obliterating shape and shadow, reducing the waiting darkness to splinters and dust. Then it was gone. Silence returned in its wake, heavy and absolute. Caleb lay on his side, breath coming in shallow, ragged pulls. Pain radiated through his chest with every inhale, his arm hanging uselessly at his side. The wood beneath him was warm from the friction of steel, the smell of hot metal lingering in the air. He forced himself to sit up. The trestle stretched empty in both directions. No hoofprints marked the planks. No shadow lingered at the far end. The rails lay still. Their faint hum faded into nothing. Dawn light crept along the horizon, washing the bridge in pale gold. Caleb dragged himself to his feet, his leg buckling before he caught himself on the rail. Each breath burned. Each movement sent a fresh wave of pain through his body. He stood there for a long moment, swaying, the weight of survival settling over him like a second skin. He looked down the length of the trestle where Luke had stood, where the darkness had waited, where the world had split open and swallowed everything Caleb had been too afraid to claim. The silence held. He spoke into it. "Luke." Not in grief, not in longing, in gratitude. The words settled into the wood and iron, carried by the faint stir of morning air. Caleb turned and began the slow walk off the trestle, each step a sharp reminder of the cost he carried. The insects resumed their chorus as he reached the trees, the sound rising around him like a promise that the world, scarred and imperfect, still continued. He did not look back.
Please make sure you are subscribed and be one of the strange.